Hi, everybody. I'm really glad you could join us. It's good to be inside tonight, isn't it? I just was outside for a couple minutes and it is still hot. I think it's got to be above 90 still. Even at my house, I'm at 1,000 feet. Okay, so let me see. This isn't moving. There we go. Why are you here tonight, folks? You can unmute and tell me. Are you here because you're saving seeds? You want to save seeds? You want to know how to do it better? Have you saved seeds before? Anybody?
I'll start. I'm here because I want to save seeds. I've saved some seeds, but I'd like to I grow mostly heirlooms, and so I'm trying to create my own seed bank for myself so I'm not buying seeds, and also to share. Thank you.
Good idea. Anybody else?
I've never saved seeds, so this is a first for me.
Well, I never had either, and it's really fun. Janet, your mic's off.
Yeah, no, I have saved seeds, tomato seeds mostly, some flower seeds too, but I want to find out if I'm even doing anything right.
Well, it's funny. Before I started doing this, I didn't realize how technical it is to get it right. And we'll talk about that. But, you can always grow tomatoes. It's a question of if you got the tomato you thought you were going to grow. Anybody else?
Yeah, I've already saved some bean seeds this year. I've done a fair amount of reading about it, but I would like to, if the world crashes and I have to go live in the boonies somewhere, I'd love to have, a good supply of open, source pollen, things that could reproduce and that I could use year after year, save the good ones. And I have just a little bit of a political bone to pick about seeds.
Nope.
Huh?
No, Jackie, no political bones.
Like when people steal them from indigenous people and put patents on them, and then the people can't get their own seeds, that kind of stuff. So but yeah, I'd like to have a complete collection. Actually was looking to buy some last night that I have a ton of seeds already, but the kind that you can trust year after year and improve.
Okay. Catherine?
Yes, I really would like to learn how to save tomato seeds. I get volunteers.
And how do they taste, Catherine?
Sweet. They're good.
You may have one that is one of the open pollinators. What's been kind of stable for very good shape.
Mine was, I think it was from a chocolate tomato I grew last.
I'm on a Zoom video.
So,
it was really good. So anyway, that's what came back again this year, but they don't look quite so brown.
yeah. Well, we'll talk about why that happens and what kind, if you're going to grow tomatoes, which kind you grow and if you want to have them. Okay, everybody, please mute your mics. There's a lot of background noise.
And also I wanted to learn about lilacs, if you know lilac seeds.
I can talk about lilacs. We're talking mostly vegetable saving, and there are better ways to reproduce lilacs than seeds for sure. If you'd like to know about that, I can send you something. I'd be happy to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so moving on. It's fun. It's fun to save seeds. I started working with the I don't know if you're even aware of this, before COVID locked us down, the Longview Library had was setting up a seed saving program, just like Jackie was talking about. I was going in and giving the initial introduction to it, and a lot of speakers were going to be coming in to help people save seeds, and they had little bitty envelopes that they were handing out to people, and everybody was going to bring in seeds, and we would have our own community library of free seeds. And we're going to have to do it again next year. It didn't work this year, which is too bad. So, and like some of you said, it's cheaper. It's a lot cheaper to buy them or to save your own than to buy them in the store. and you can buy things you can't get anywhere else. And the big thing about growing your own seeds is that, or saving your own seeds, is that they grow well in our climate. They grew in your soil. You save the best tomato from the best plants you have, and that seed over time, if you keep collecting from that tomato, it's going to be perfect for our climate. There are some caveats there, but that's pretty much the, that's a good summary for it. So why should we save seeds? Well, like Jackie was saying, if the world comes to an end and you have to go live in the boonies, we need to protect our heirlooms and even the hybrid parents, and we'll talk about what hybrids are, from cross-pollination from genetically modified plants. We want to preserve the genetic diversity. I'll talk about this later too, but we used to have a lot more seeds, a lot more varieties than we do now. We just don't have many. And part of the problem is if we do have just a monoculture, say just one or two kinds of tomatoes or potatoes for that matter, we could be in a lot of trouble. Remember the Irish potato famine? It led to the death or displacement of 2.5 million people in the 1840s. Potatoes aren't from Ireland. All Irish potatoes descended from just a few handfuls of potato varieties brought back to Europe from South America in the 1600s. And this potato monoculture ended up being susceptible to late blight, which is caused by a fungus. And the South American potato farmers had hundreds of different varieties, but we didn't. And the Irish farmers just had those few varieties, and they all succumbed. And when you have uniformity in crops like that, you've got a real problem. One dies, they all die. And I didn't know about this one, but did you know that there was a U.S. corn blight epidemic in 1970? All the corn hybrids that were descended from one blight-susceptible family, and 15% of our corn was lost. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but that's a lot of corn. But they did find that most of the old open-pollinated varieties are resistant to the blight. That's because they've got more genetic diversity. So, everybody has seed stories. My grandfather used to bring us these huge old beefsteaks, what I would give for some seeds from that. And I know that there are some people, somebody was telling me that their grandfather, they went through their grandfather's house, and in the bottom of his sock drawer in a corner in a little envelope were some seeds. They had no idea what they were. They planted them. Grandpa hadn't had a garden for, probably 50 years. And they planted them, and they got tomatoes. And I talk about an heirloom and a story, The thing about, it's almost too late in the season to be able to save seeds properly because you need to do some planning ahead of time. However, we'll find some things that are safe to save that will be a good thing to save this fall. But if you start next spring when you're planting your garden, you'll be able to do a better job. And we're also going to talk about how to save them. Now, here's the thing. Before 1900, 50% of the people were farmers, and now there's just 2%. And they all had their own seeds. John down the street down the road would give them the tomatoes, plant seeds that he had. Somebody else would share the corn. They didn't go to the stores. That's how they got their seeds. What's really interesting is, how do you think we got these? The plants that we're saving the seeds from. Back when the hunter-gatherers started growing crops, they started out as wild plants before they could do that. The ladies who were usually the gatherers would go out and bring home some greens or whatever, that roots or whatever, and the ones they liked, they planted usually, or they keep an eye on. Eventually, somebody made the connection between the seeds, and they would start planting the seeds, and they would get rid of the ones that didn't taste good until they found one that was pretty stable and it tasted good. And that's where we got every single vegetable that we eat now. So the difference between wild plants and the vegetables we eat today, about 10,000 years. In the summer of 1816, it was so cold in New England that there was a snowstorm or severe frost every month. And this is written in history books. Thousands of settlers pulled up stakes and headed west, looking for someplace a little bit better because, who wants snow in June? In the remote northern Vermont Valley, where it's not Calais, it's Calais, was a village, and only one kind of corn survived there because it was a terrible summer. It snowed in June. They had freezing temperatures in July. But the local Abenaki native tribe for generations had been growing this kind of corn, and they gave it to the settlers who had remained and hadn't fled west, and it was the sole sustenance for many families that year. And the Fair family, since that time, they saved that corn, even when the Native Americans that originally gave them the corn no longer had it. And it was found in somebody's basement, and the family gave it back to the tribe. And the funny thing is that Calais farmers gave the seed to the Vermont seedman Tom Stearns, who shared it with Fedco, and now they're selling it. Okay. Less than 10% of all the fruit and vegetables that were grown in 1900 are still with us today because we started to hybridize them because they were stable for shipping. They made these tomatoes that were exactly the same size. They could put exactly the same number of tomatoes in a box. They were pretty, and I can remember as a kid that my mom would go and pick out a tomato and cut it up into 20 different pieces because there were 9 of us. But they came in February and they tasted like mush, but they sure were pretty. And 5 companies now control 70% of the seeds being distributed. And Seminus, the company Seminus, has 40% of it. There's an open source seed initiative, and today only a handful of these companies account for most of the world's commercial breeding and seed savings. They produce patented seeds that it's illegal to save or replant or be shared by farmers and us, home gardeners too. The OSSI works with plant breeders who commit to make one or more of these varieties available under a pledge which says that anybody can use these, but in return, you pledge not to restrict other people's use for them, and you're not allowed to derive patented seeds from these. And there's a list of those. If you go to seed list OSSI, you'll find this. That doesn't stop most of us. We just save whatever seeds we have, and I suppose if some people have gotten in trouble, most of the times they leave us alone because we're pretty small potatoes. But genetic diversity is disappearing, and we're going to pay the price for it if we don't do something about it. So why are seed libraries important? Just like Jackie was saying, we want to be able to get our own seeds in our own neighborhoods and have the seeds that grow well here. And what's fun is the more people you get saving seeds, the more people are gardening, the more people are learning about it. Did I just lose my screen share, folks?
No,
I did. Okay. And again, we're trying to promote biodiversity, and we're trying to preserve our cultural heritage because whoever owns the seeds controls the food supply, and that's scary. Look at this. Back in 1903, these were the different varieties that were available. And over the years, once things became patented, this is all we've got left of those. And once people stopped sharing between each other and we started buying from stores. It's really kind of scary. Okay, now to saving seeds. Now, I know this is going to be boring for some of you, but I'm telling you this stuff for a reason, because if you don't understand it, you're not going to be able to save the seeds right. So there are some flowers out there that are self-pollinating. And this is an example of a self-pollinating flower. It's got the male parts and the female parts, and they pollinate themselves. Some of them, like tomatoes, usually pollinate themselves before the flower even opens. So with tomatoes, that's one of them that's pretty safe to grow again, or to save the seeds. It's a good chance that if it was an heirloom or open pollinated seed from a packet that you bought, it'll be the same if you save those seeds. Then there are those that require self-pollination by wind, maybe, or by insects, where the pollen from one can get or does get onto the female part, the stigma of another plant. When you have a plant like this, you don't really know what you're going to get. If you've got this kind of a squash plant, and it comes over to this different kind of a squash plant, you could have somewhere in between there. Somebody's got their mic on. Thank you. Okay. So now, plants from the same species can pollinate each other. I had a question once from a fellow who said, I had a watermelon I only planted watermelons, and look what came out. It's a cucumber. No, it's in a different species. So tomatoes can only cross with other tomatoes. Eggplants, their species is different. And the squashes, cucumbers, and melons, they make it very difficult because there are, I think, 5 different groups, and only the ones in those little groups can actually cross-pollinate. And boy, do they cross-pollinate. They're very, very promiscuous, I should say. Okay, so here we go with the open pollinated variety. Most of the open pollinated varieties, it simply means that they're fairly stable. They, over time, they haven't changed a whole lot. But the Sweet Million, I'll bet a lot of you like Sweet Million. It's a wonderfully prolific, really good tasting tomato. But it's an F1 hybrid cultivar. And a cultivar means it's a cultivated variety that humans made. They crossed this particular plant with that particular tomato, and it came up with Sweet Million. Now, if you try to plant Sweet Million like I have in my garden, I've got about 5 volunteer plants, and they're really vigorous, really growing good. From one plant, the tomatoes are excellent. The other ones, they look excellent, and they taste like mush, because I got something that hybrids don't breed true. So their parent and the hybrid, they just can breed just about anything. So any non-hybrid is called open pollinated. All heirloom plants are open pollinated, but they've been stable for generations. Usually, if you plant a seed from an open pollinated plant, it will breed true. You will get the same plant. And tomatoes, beans, peas, and lettuce are ones that are pretty easy to breed, to save the seeds from, because you don't have to do a whole lot to them, because most of them are self-pollinated. So, okay. One of my master gardener friends sent me a picture of her. In fact, I need to share this with her. She says something showed up in her garden that looks like the middle picture here. And she says it looks like it crossed it with a zucchini. It can't, because zucchinis and butternuts can't, zucchinis and butternuts or cushaws can't cross because they're in a different species group. But these two can cross, and look what you can get from it. You might get one that looks like the parent plant, but more likely you're going to get something that looks like one of those. And the taste, who knows? It might be wonderful. It might taste like mush. Here's what you can get from a hybrid tomato, cross-pollinating 2 different pepper plants, and they are not self-pollinating. So if you want that pepper, you have to be really careful about protecting that blossom. But this is what you can get when you cross these 2. Just about anything. My brother went to Costco one time and bought one of those bags full of the real pretty rainbow peppers. And he planted the seeds And he got different sizes, different colors, different flavors. Some were good. So he created his own hybrids. He was very proud of himself, but he didn't save the seeds. The thing is, an F1 hybrid just means it's the first generation. He would have to breed only that for several generations to make sure that it was stable before he could be fairly sure that he would get that same pepper plant each time he saved the seeds. This is what happens when you cross this tomato with one of these. Not that you do it on purpose, but it might happen in the field. You'll get something halfway in between. A couple more terms that are important. Most of the vegetables that we plant in our gardens, not all of them, but most of them that we plant are annuals. They complete their growth cycle in 1 year. In our climate, cucumbers, peppers, tomatoes, beans, we plant the seed in the spring, they do their thing, we harvest them, then the plant dies. Those are annuals. Now biennials are a little bit different. They complete their life cycle in two seasons, which means that it takes 2 years for them to go to seed. The first year you plant carrots, you get this fluffy stuff coming out, real pretty ferny foliage, and then most of us pull the carrots out, harvest them, and eat them. But if you let those go, or if you take them out during the winter time and then plant them again in spring, they'll continue to grow, but they'll make flowers the next year and go to seed. So if you really enjoy planting carrots from seed, that would be the way to go. It's the same thing with cabbage and broccoli too, and beets. The problem with carrots that you've got to be really careful of, I don't know if you've seen those weeds on the side of the road. When I was growing up, they were called Queen Anne's lace, but another common name for them is wild carrot. They're round disc flowers about this big, and about that big, and they're white and flat topped. And that's wild carrot. And they can cross-pollinate with carrots, and you get something totally inedible. So if you're going to try to save seeds from carrot the second year that they create flowers, you've got to make sure that they're protected from any kind of pollen floating around. So I had a big discussion with the fellow at Boston at the library in Woodland area in Longview. He wanted to save only pure seeds, get an open pollinated seed, protect it so nothing else pollinates it, so it's exactly the same as the parent plant. But the thing is, your backyard can be your scientific lab. What's the worst that can happen? You can eat it. If the squash isn't a real great tasting squash, you can put it in a stew or something. It's a great way to have fun and to kind of explore what you can do. So the ones that I would suggest you start with, because they're frequently self-pollinating, are tomatoes, beans, peas, and lettuce. You don't have to do much to protect them from being pollinated by another plant. You have a really good chance of getting a plant a fruit, a vegetable that tastes and looks like the parent plant next year. Those are really easy to grow and a great place to start. I will go here. This is why tomato plants, or some of these, are self-pollinating. Inside of I don't know if you've ever looked inside of a pea or bean plant, but they've got this thing called a keel. And inside that are the female and male parts of the flower. And before it opens, those have already done their thing, and when it opens, it's no longer receptive to other pollen. And the same thing with the tomato. It's got fused anthers, and they are inside there. And that's a lot of times, if you have a tomato in a greenhouse, you're not going to end up with you're not going to end up with tomatoes, because there's no wind to jostle the tomato around unless you go in there and kind of, ruffle them just to get things moving around. Usually the wind will do that. So something you might want to, this is For tomatoes, it's not really that important. But what's important is if you're trying to maintain genetic diversity over time, like Jackie's trying to do, you've got to have at least 5 to 10 plants. If you're just want to keep that tomato for next year, you only need the one plant. But the problem is, in 20 years, if you're saving that plant for 20, the seeds from that plant for 20 years, and it's growing great here, it's acclimated to our area, it likes your soil, it likes your climate, and all of a sudden we have climate change, and it didn't have the diversity of being around the other plants, it might not have what it takes to be able to live in changed conditions. Now peppers, I can't ask y'all. Peppers are really hard to grow here. At least they are at my altitude. We're at 1,000 feet. Peppers don't like cool nights. That's the problem. If you have peppers, you want to be growing them on a very warm surface, like next to a driveway, or maybe with a brick wall or rock wall behind it. Something to keep it warm during the night when it gets down into the 50s. It does not like that. And we'll talk about ways that you can isolate the blossoms. Lettuce, that's usually not too much of a problem. It's not very often that you get wind or insect pollination, but you can still protect those too if you want to. And beans, they usually also self-pollinate. Now, if you want a pepper and you don't want to have to, you want seeds from that pepper, you can go in with a little paintbrush. And then after it's pollinated, you want to cover it for a couple days with one of these little bags that you get at weddings and stuff like that, the organza bags. And then it'll be fertilized, and then you can just let it go. And you know that you're going to get the correct seeds from at least that pepper. If you don't do it on all the blossoms, you may not get the right seeds that you want from that plant. And they did this with tomatoes. I'm not sure it's necessary, but because most of the time they fertilize before, or they are fertilized before they open. So once you get into the other ones, other than those that we talked about, it's really hard to come up with the same parent unless you do a lot of planning ahead of time. And the other thing about the wind-pollinated or insect-pollinated plants, you've got to have a whole lot more of the plant to make sure that you've got a good genetic diversity, and you've got to be able to isolate those flowers in some way. Now that looks funny. So you can do time isolation. You can plant early and late varieties. As long as they're not flowering at the same time, you're in good shape. Distance, there are charts out there that tell you if you're planting peppers, you need X amount of distance between the plants, and that'll really cut down on the chance of cross-pollination. If you're growing something like corn, which you really don't want to mix different varieties of corn, especially sweet corn and popcorn, that they don't turn out very good. You can use physical landscape things like buildings or hedges, something that'll stop the wind, slow the wind down from pollinating your different varieties of corn. I've seen people do this. They actually cover the whole thing, and you wonder, well, how am I going to get the pollinators in there? What a lot of people do is if they've got like 3 different kind of plants that they don't want to cross-pollinate with each other, they'll cover 2 of them during the day and leave the other one out, and they know that that one will probably, pollinate itself, and then take it off at night because the bees are in bed, nobody's going to pollinate, and then rotate through it. And you're giving your plant better odds that it's not going to get cross-pollinated by one of those that you don't want it to. And of course, if you, broccoli, something like that, only plant one variety that you like and save it. That's another way you can do it. But a lot of places, the library was suggesting that you bag your little fruits. Now these people are serious. They have everything bagged. They want to make sure that they're getting what they're saving. I'll bet you every single one of you that has grown cucumbers or squash have ended up with horrible looking little dead baby cucumbers or baby squash at the beginning of the year, right? I'm here to tell you why. Take a look at these different flowers. They look alike, right? The flowers do. Look at their stems. See, this has a baby zucchini at the end. This is just a straight stalk. Well, if you looked inside, you'd see a difference too. This is the male with the straight stalk, and this is the female that has the baby cucumber or the baby squash. And this is actually the ovary. That's where the plant needs to make seeds. That's its biological imperative. One of the ways that you can make sure that you get good squash early in the season, I'll show you that in a minute, is to do the pollinating yourself. You can very easily see the difference. And usually it'll get a little bit bigger than this. It'll grow and it'll grow. If it doesn't get good pollination, it'll grow. And when it realizes that it's putting energy into a fruit that it's not going to be able to have seeds, it stops growing and it dies. Early in the season, too, we have cold weather and we may not have a lot of pollinators out there. If we do, they might not be as active as we need them to be. And cold weather itself also makes a big difference. So here's what you do. And I just did this the other day because right now on my squash plants, I have mostly male, for some reason, mostly male flowers. I've got a couple females and I want to make sure that they get pollinated. So you go out and you have to do it early because the pollen's fresh and the flowers are just opening. Find the female plant, but find the male, peel all the leaves off the male, or at least be able to get access to the male stamen there, and just kind of gently rub it against the female stigma. Get the pollen all over it. And you'll close it up. I'll show you, I think that's the next slide. And then fertilization will be done by noon. It happens really quickly. And this is how you do it. See all the pollen there? And just gently rub it against there. And you can tie it up very, very gently. You don't want to hurt anything. You don't want to hurt the flower parts here because the pollen tube is being formed and it's going to go down here, take the pollen down into the ovary and fertilize the little eggs, the little ovules. You can cover it with a little piece of sticky note, or you can just cover it with gauze. And I did this year and I had wonderful results. I have really good results early. I didn't have the usual dead squash or cucumbers that I usually do. So now that we know which seeds are easiest to save and ways to get the seeds that you want, and that's the other thing with the cucumber, the reason I showed you that, with the cucumbers and the squash, you are assured of getting that squash. Like I said before, cucumbers and squash readily self-pollinate, or cross-pollinate, and you can end up with something that you really didn't plan on. So if you want to save one of those, you really need to plan for it and take the pollination into your own hands, literally. Okay, now this is what you came for. You need to harvest from a real healthy, very mature plant, and you want to make sure it's the best possible one that you've got. You don't want one that's kind of icky looking and didn't grow as big as the others, or one of the plants that's been stressed by maybe disease or you didn't water it well enough. You want a really good specimen. And the seeds have to be clean and dry, and you and I both know that when you take a tomato seed out of the tomato, it's not clean and it's not dry, but there are ways to get around that. So once we get the seeds dry, we need a moisture-proof, airtight container, and I keep mine in one of those, I have mason jars, but I also have one of those plastic jars that mixed nuts comes in from Costco. And I make sure they're dry before I put them in, and I store them, because I'm not storing them for very long, I store them in my basement in the unfinished part where it's usually about 60 degrees all year long. The colder you keep them, the longer they'll keep. If you freeze them, they'll last a lot longer. And I don't know that I have the actual times for those. No, I don't. Let me see. I might have them over there. Nope, I don't. And don't forget to label. Keep really good notes on it. what kind of variety it is and the date. And storing can, like I said, I'll be able to use my plants from the basement for a year. If you freeze them, you'll be able to use them for longer than that. And to tell the truth, you know, that guy that found the seeds in his basement, his grandfather's drawer, they'll save a lot longer than that if you're lucky, or at least some of them will. If you don't make sure your seed is dry, you're going to end up with fungus growing on it in your little envelope. So if you can make it snap, it's dry. If it bends and it doesn't snap, it's too wet. And if it crushes like this, like a nut, and it breaks into a million pieces, it's dry. And if it just kind of squishes, it's still too wet. One way to make sure that those kind of seeds get really dry before you store them, you can bake a cup of rice in the oven just to get it hot and really, really dry. And while the rice is still hot, you put it into a glass jar and screw the lid on. Let it cool down completely. And then get your seeds, like your pumpkin seeds or something like that, put them in a sock or a gauze, a little piece of gauze, and tie it. And mind you, this is cool. And then place the sock in the jar with the lid for about 24 hours. This works well with a cell phone that's been dropped in the toilet as well. I know this is a fact. So it will dry your seeds and it will dry your cell phone. That was a brand new cell phone my husband sent into the drink. Okay, so let's save some. I hope you've grown something that you love, and I'm really hoping that what you grew wasn't a hybrid. So make sure if you saved a seed packet to check, because the only ones that you really want to save are open pollinated or heirloom, because you should be able to get exactly the same plant as the parent. And I can't remember who it was that told me they were growing tomatoes from a volunteer that came up. If it was a hybrid, you might not get the same thing. But if that volunteer that came up was from an open pollinated or an heirloom, chances are it is the same thing. Okay, these are the ones that we're going to talk about saving. Some, like beans and peas, they have that outer coating on them. It makes it really a pain in the neck. You could sit and clean the chaff off each one, but there are easier ways to do it. You can get off the pods as much as you can, and then you can kind of put it down into a pan in front of, or pour it in front of a fan, and that lightweight chaff will go and the seeds will fall to the bottom. You may have to do that several times to get the seeds away from the stuff you're throwing away. The other thing, when you've got peas and beans, a lot of people say stick them in a bag, not a paper bag for those. You can do that with the lettuce seeds, but with the beans, you can put them in a pillowcase and kind of walk on them a little bit, very gently, kind of rub them back and forth on a cement, in the bag, on cement, and that'll get most of it off. That saves you a lot of time rather than sitting there picking everything off. But they say to use progressively smaller screens to get most of the chaff off, and then you've got those off, and it gets smaller and smaller until all you have left is the seeds. So for lettuce and brassicas, the cabbage family, carrots, you'll harvest them when they're completely dry, really, really dry. You don't want to bring them into the house unless it's raining. It's going to start raining, you know it is. Then you can bring it in and hang it upside down in the garage or a shed that's dry. Please mute. Thank you. So you'll crumble the seed heads in a bowl, and then you'll separate it either by screening or winnowing. Now, for seeds with no pulp, like eggplants and peppers, squash and melons, they aren't slippery and slimy like cucumbers and tomatoes are. They're pretty straightforward. But you do want to keep them on the plant until they're way over mature. You wouldn't eat them. They would be overdone for you. And you want to let the squash continue to mature off the vine before harvesting, but we'll talk about that. Then you gather the seeds, you rinse well, pat to dry, finish drying on a plate or a coffee filter. Very easy. But again, they've got to be very dry. Now, the tomatoes and cucumbers, they're a little bit harder. You harvest the fruit when it's fully ripe on the vine. The cucumber should be turning yellow, the kind that you throw to your chickens if you have them. You cut the fruit open and squeeze out the seeds and the pulp into a jar. Just squeeze it right out. And you're going to end up with those slimy seeds in a jar of water. And you cover them, and then you cover them with wax paper or paper towel, and you let them sit for about 5 days, and they'll get this mold growing all over the top of them. And then after you see that mold, and it has a couple days to develop really good, the non-viable seeds will float to the top, and you could very carefully pour them and the mold off the top. And then you can just rinse those off, keep rinsing them until the water's clear, and that gel coat will be gone. That gel coat is on there because it helps to prevent the seed from germinating inside the fruit. And we have to remove that so that it will germinate for us when we plant it in soil. There's something else I was going to tell you about that. Anyhow, let's see, use a strainer to catch the seeds and rinse it again. And when you're done, place them on I wouldn't put them on a paper plate. I changed that. I'd put it on a glass plate, pat them to dry and put it on a glass plate. And it may take up to 4 to 5 days to dry completely, depending on the humidity of your house. And again, try the snap test with your fingernail. If it snaps, you could break it in half with your fingernail, then it's dry enough. If it isn't, let it sit another couple days. So this is what your pea should look like by the time you get it. It should be shriveled and hard, and very, very brittle. If you try to get it from here, the seeds aren't going to be ready. And if you can, let the pods dry on the vine. Everything needs to be dry, everything. Okay, I think you break them over a bowl, and you can store those for 7 to 10 days in the freezer. We don't have much in the way of weevils here, but you can get them. And so if you freeze them for 7 to 10 days, that will kill them. Lettuce is kind of fun. You can harvest a few the outer leaves so that you can have some salad from it. But the seeds are ready in 21 days. That's almost immediate gratification. To harvest them, you shake this seed head vigorously into a bag every day during that period. You can actually, if you want to, put it on the plant outside when some of them are dry, some of the seeds are dry and all the pods are dry, and just keep shaking it. But the seeds that fall off like that will be ready. And some people just bring it into the garage, hang it upside down, and just beat on the bag a couple times during the day, and the seeds will fall down and you'll be able to save them. But all that chaff will have to be removed through the winnowing process we talked about. Brassicas are also very easily cross-pollinated. You could end up with a broccoli Brussels sprout mix, or I don't know about cabbage, but I know cabbage and Brussels sprouts will cross too. I just don't know what they would make. So harvest when the seed pod halfway up the stalk is full of seeds and have plumped out as much as they're going to. But they've got to be starting to turn brown because that shows that they're mature. And then that too, hang the flower stalks up to dry and then break them open over a bowl, and then winnow the chaff away from the seeds. Okay, we actually kind of talked about that. Yep, we did, didn't we? I didn't realize I had that on twice. So, but make sure when you put them out to dry, don't put them in the sunlight. You might be tempted to, but not a good idea. You can also dry seeds in a dehydrator, but I don't remember what the directions are for that. You'd have to look that up. I had it at one point, but I don't think I have. Let me see if I have that information. Nope, I don't have it out. But it'll take about 2 weeks to dry completely. And again, make sure they're completely dry. The other thing I do to make sure that they are dry and going to stay that way, you know those little what do they call them? The dehydrator little packets that they're in your vitamins and stuff and your medicines and stuff. I'll put those in the jar too. My seeds are separate in an envelope, but I put that in to make sure that no extra moisture will bother the seeds. Cucumbers and melons, this is what they should look like. Really bad. You would never eat those. They'd be very bitter. And the skin's really hard and they're yellow. And you want to take the seeds from the blossom end. So it would be here. The stalk was down here. It came off the plant here. This is the blossom end, and it's the oldest part, the most mature part of the fruit. So that's where you want to save those from. And again, you do the same thing that you did with the tomatoes. Get the seeds and the gel into a bowl of water and cover it, and wait until the mold forms. Pour it off. Get rid of the ones that float to the top and the mold, and then just rinse and rinse and rinse and rinse again in a sieve, and then put them on a glass plate to dry. Now, summer and winter squash, it's too early to save those yet. You don't even pick winter squash until they're right before frost, actually, when they come away from the vine, break away from the vine very easily. And then you want to store them for another couple months to let those seeds mature even further. Summer squash and zucchini, the other summer squash, they have to be really large, overripe, the ones that you would probably stick in somebody's car if they kept their door unlocked and you had a bumper crop of them. But you only want to use the ones that are far from the furthest from where the stem was. You want to go to the blossom end, the oldest part of the fruit, to get the most ripe seeds. And then when you bring the zucchini and store them for an extra 3 to 4 weeks, just to let them mature a little bit more. And they're pretty easy. You just work the seeds between your fingers to get the pulp away from them. They don't need to be soaked. Just get them clean. I don't know if you've ever cut open an eggplant, but they got really tiny little seeds. And the best way to do that, for one thing, they need to look like this. They're the ones that you get in the store in the middle of the winter time when you can't get them fresh, but that's what they look like. You leave the ripe fruits on the plant for 4 or 5 extra weeks to let them get really, really mature. And it should turn to that dull tan or brown. And again, you'll only save the seeds from that bottom part of the fruit because they're more mature. And you use a box grater to get them out. Peppers are fun. They're easy to do because they don't have that gel coat either. But this is what the peppers should look like. They should be wrinkled and really, really ripe. And if you have green peppers and you know they're supposed to be green, let them get red anyway. Most peppers will turn to red, orange, or yellow when they're really, really ripe. And they get dull. They're not real pretty and shiny. So you cut through the shoulder up here and gently scrape all the seeds from the fruit and spread them out to dry. That's all there is to it. And then label them and store them. Hot peppers can be left on the plant and let them dry that way. And I know a lot of people will pull the plants from the ground toward the end of the year and just hang the entire plants up in their garage or someplace warm. And again, we're covering tomatoes. Anyhow, this is what it looks like. It looks really gross. And that happens after 4 to 5 days. And I don't know if you can see it here, but you've got some bad tomato seeds that aren't any good floating to the top, but you've got a lot of the good stuff down there. Okay, we've talked about this a couple times. It says to remove the white mold with a spoon. You don't really need to. You just have to if you tilt the jar and kind of scoop it out along with the seeds floating on the top, you can do it that way. So the moral of this story is start small. Start with the seeds that you know that you can easily saved, like the tomatoes and the beans and peas and lettuce. Know if it's an annual or biannual, if it's self-pollinated or cross-pollinated, because that determines how you're going to either protect it or you don't have to protect it from being cross-pollinated. We talked about different ways to isolate your blossoms so they don't get cross-pollinated and how to harvest, dry, and store them.